Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in an era defined not by what is, but by what is breaking down. Systems that once provided stability, governments, currencies, institutions are faltering under the weight of their own contradictions. In such an environment, holding cash, once the ultimate symbol of security, has become an act of quiet self-sabotage. You are told cash is freedom, but today cash is surveillance. You are told it's safety, but today it is decay. Why? Because the foundations upon which cash relies, trust in monetary policy, sovereignty of states, and the illusion of control, are dissolving faster than most realize. The concept of safety in financial systems has always been more psychological than rational. What the average citizen considers safe is usually a reflection of institutional narratives, not empirical truth. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the persistent belief that holding cash paper money, fiat currency, provides a shield against economic turbulence. It is a deeply ingrained illusion, one that persists only because most people have not yet questioned the assumptions that uphold it. But the cracks are visible, and those who can read systems, not headlines, already understand that cash is no longer a safe haven. In fact, it is becoming one of the most vulnerable positions a person can hold. This isn't about sudden collapse or cinematic doom scenarios. The erosion of cash's value is slow, systemic, and deliberately engineered. Inflation, once considered an anomaly, has become institutionalized. It is not merely the result of supply shocks or global conflict. It is a monetary feature. Central banks, in their pursuit of growth and debt servicing, have embraced a model that rewards debtors and penalizes savers. When you hold cash, you are subsidizing those who borrow and speculate. You are effectively paying a quiet tax, one that compounds invisibly with time. Moreover, the safety of cash depends on trust. Trust in the central bank not to debase the currency, trust in the banking system not to restrict access, and trust in governments to uphold the legal and functional neutrality of money. These assumptions are no longer valid. When interest rates are kept artificially low, or when monetary expansion becomes perpetual, the real return on cash trends towards zero, and often negative when adjusted for inflation. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system, designed not to preserve wealth, but to mobilize it preferably through consumption, debt, or speculative capital flows. Passive holders are left to wither. There's also a subtler shift underway, one that transcends economics and moves into the realm of control. Cash, as we've known it, represented a final bastion of privacy and autonomy. But as societies pivot toward digital currencies and algorithmic compliance, the very nature of money is being redefined. Physical cash is increasingly marginalized, not because it has lost utility, but because it is harder to track. In a system obsessed with surveillance that makes it undesirable, policies are being implemented quietly, but aggressively, to limit large cash transactions, flag withdrawals, and condition citizens to accept full transparency in exchange for the illusion of security. One need not be conspiratorial to observe the trajectory. When the medium of exchange becomes programmable, it is no longer neutral. Money begins to serve not just economic purposes, but political ones. And under such conditions, holding traditional cash or even its digital equivalents inside fragile banking structures ceases to be a safe, let alone sovereign, act. Furthermore, the geopolitical dimension cannot be ignored. The trust that underpins fiat currency is largely dependent on the geopolitical credibility of the issuing state. But in an era where alliances are shifting, trade wars are escalating, and reserve currencies are quietly contested, that credibility is eroding. When nations begin to question each other's solvency or intentions, so too do capital flows, and in that recalibration, cash, especially local cash, becomes a hostage to forces far beyond the control of ordinary individuals. The irony is that people cling to cash for its perceived stability, yet that stability is an artifact of an era that is closing. The post-war economic consensus that made fiat currency appear unshakable is fracturing. The social contracts between governments and citizens are being renegotiated in real time. As that process accelerates, those still anchored to the old assumptions will suffer the most. This is not a call for panic. It is a call for recognition. Cash still has utility, but safety is no longer one of its attributes. Safety today must be sought in optionality, in diversification, in jurisdictions, in assets that do not rely on the perpetual competence or goodwill of central authorities. The safe haven of the past has become the trap of the present, and those who continue to treat cash as sanctuary will find themselves exposed not suddenly, but structurally, and with no way out once the shift becomes visible to all. In recent years, something subtle yet profoundly transformative has been unfolding, a shift so quiet that most people remain unaware, yet so consequential that it reshapes the very concept of economic freedom. Currencies, once neutral instruments of exchange, are being refashioned into tools of control. This is not occurring with dramatic declarations or sweeping reforms, but through a steady series of policies, technological shifts, and regulatory changes that, taken together, represent a fundamental redefinition of what money is and whom it serves. The promise of currency has always been that it stands apart from ideology. It does not judge, it does not discriminate. It is a medium that allows value to move freely between individuals, across borders, and through time. But this ideal has been eroded. Slowly, the autonomy of currency is being replaced by a logic of surveillance, compliance, and behavioral conditioning. And the most disturbing aspect of this development is that it is happening under the banner of efficiency and security. The first phase of this transformation was subtle. Under the guise of anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism measures, financial institutions were required to implement increasingly rigorous monitoring. At first glance, these measures seemed reasonable. Who would oppose efforts to prevent illicit finance? But soon, what began as a narrow focus on criminal activity expanded into a sweeping apparatus of financial scrutiny. Large withdrawals trigger alerts. Private transfers are flagged. Savings beyond certain thresholds are examined for their origin. The presumption of innocence has been quietly reversed. Then came the digital acceleration. As more transactions moved online, cash, physical, anonymous, decentralized, became increasingly inconvenient. Governments began to discourage its use, citing everything from hygiene to fraud prevention. But behind the rhetoric lay a strategic intent to make all financial activity observable, recordable, and ultimately controllable. Once currency exists only in digital form, it ceases to be a bearer instrument. It becomes a permissioned asset, one that functions only under terms dictated by its issuer. The idea of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, marks the next evolution. These are not merely electronic versions of cash. They are programmable instruments. Unlike paper notes, which are inherently neutral, CBDCs can be designed to expire, to be spent only on certain goods, to be limited by geography, or to be taxed in real time. This is not speculation. These features have been openly discussed in policy forums and technical white papers. The potential for behavioral manipulation is enormous. With programmable money, compliance becomes embedded in the currency itself. And what of dissent? In a world where all transactions are traceable, economic disobedience becomes nearly impossible. Suppose a citizen wishes to support a cause unpopular with the authorities. In a fully digitized system, that transaction can be blocked. The donor can be penalized, the cause can be defunded. In effect, money becomes a form of speech and one that can be censored. The financial system morphs from a conduit of value into an instrument of power. Even the architecture of the global financial system is being redesigned to reflect this shift. Sanctions, once rare and targeted, are now deployed with increasing frequency as geopolitical tools. The weaponization of the dollar, for example, has forced many nations to rethink their dependence on it, but the irony is that, while the global south seeks alternatives, many individuals in developed economies still believe their savings are apolitical. They fail to grasp that what is legal today may be criminalized tomorrow, and that access to their own money is contingent on political conditions they do not control. The implications extend beyond finance. When economic agency is constrained, so too is democratic agency. The freedom to save, to invest, to transact, these are the foundations of personal sovereignty. Once they are eroded, the individual becomes not a participant in the economy, but a subject of it. And the economy itself becomes not a domain of possibility, but a system of managed outcomes. What makes this transformation especially dangerous is that it wears the mask of progress. It presents itself as modernization, as convenience, as safety. But the cost is not immediately visible. It accumulates slowly in the form of dependency, in the normalization of oversight, in the quiet abandonment of autonomy. By the time the full consequences are felt, the mechanisms of resistance may already be dismantled. It is not paranoia to recognize patterns, it is prudence. History has shown that tools of control, once created, do not remain idle. The challenge is not to resist technology, but to insist that technology serves freedom, not authority. Because when money ceases to be neutral, freedom itself becomes a conditional privilege, and in that world, those who fail to act or to understand will not merely lose their wealth, they will lose their agency. The concept of risk, once a calculable element in the machinery of finance, has become something far more elusive. What we are witnessing is not simply a rise in volatility, but the emergence of a deeper, more insidious form of uncertainty, systemic risk that defies prediction, quantification, and containment. And unlike the risks of past decades, today's threats stem not from individual actors or isolated events, but from the architecture of the global system itself. We are told to trust in models, in data, in rational expectations. But this very trust has become a vulnerability. As systems grow more interconnected, they also become more brittle. Complexity gives the illusion of intelligence until a single node fails and the entire network unravels. The 2008 financial crisis was dismissed as a rare event, a black swan. Yet that swan, in retrospect, was not rare at all. It was a natural outcome of a system built on recursive leverage, blind confidence, and a false sense of control. Today, the foundations of that system remain intact. Only the language has changed. Markets are no longer shaped solely by fundamentals or human judgment. Algorithms now dominate the flow of capital, executing trades in microseconds based on signals that no human fully understands. This has not reduced risk, it has merely redistributed it, concealing it in layers of abstraction. A flash crash can erase billions in minutes. A misplaced assumption in a risk model can ripple through the system like an electrical fire behind a wall. What appears as randomness is often the result of feedback loops no longer anchored in reality. And beyond the markets, geopolitics has entered a phase where traditional alliances and power structures are no longer reliable. The post-war order that ensured relative stability is eroding. Multilateral institutions have lost legitimacy. National interest has returned as the dominant force, but without a shared framework to manage its consequences. One miscalculation, one provocation, whether in the Strait of Taiwan or a pipeline in Eastern Europe, can trigger a chain reaction far beyond the battlefield. This is the essence of systemic risk. It is not caused by the visible cracks, but by the hidden assumptions that no longer hold. Central banks, for instance, once acted as backstops. Their policies, whether QE or interest rate suppression, were believed to be omnipotent, but now we are entering a phase where the efficacy of monetary policy is diminishing. Debt levels are unsustainable. Inflation is no longer a temporary glitch. It is a structural response to years of distortion, and still, the default response is more of the same. The illusion of control persists even as the mechanisms of control become ineffective. Institutions are reactive, not proactive. They manage crises, but rarely prevent them, and the public, sensing this impotence, retreats into polarized narratives, blaming immigrants, elites, or foreign adversaries, while the real fragility remains unaddressed. When society loses trust in its institutions, financial markets soon follow, and trust, once broken, does not return quickly. Technology, for all its benefits, has accelerated the problem. It has amplified speed, not wisdom. It has connected people, but not grounded them. Social media can collapse a bank in 24 hours, as we have seen. A rumor can move markets faster than a central bank statement. In such an environment, perception is reality. And reality becomes unstable. What is often missed in mainstream discourse is that this is not simply a phase to endure. It is a structural transition. The old paradigms of growth at all costs, of central bank omnipotence, of Pax Americana, are disintegrating. What comes next is unclear, but clinging to the past is no longer a strategy. It is a liability. Those who understand this shift do not merely diversify their portfolios, they diversify their assumptions. They build resilience not through prediction but through positioning. They ask not what is likely to happen, but what is fragile and what is anti-fragile. And most importantly, they recognize that in a system on the brink, the cost of inaction is no longer zero. This is not alarmism, this is clarity. The world has changed. The map no longer matches the territory, and those still navigating by yesterday's compass will find themselves lost. In an environment where monetary systems are manipulated under the guise of stability, preserving capital has become an exercise in strategic repositioning. One must look beyond convention. The question is not where returns are highest, but where value is least likely to be confiscated directly or by erosion. Six avenues offer comparative resilience, not because they are flawless, but because they represent functional asymmetries in a deeply unbalanced global financial system. Gold remains an asset dismissed by those who misunderstand its function. It is not meant to produce yield, nor does it answer to quarterly reports or interest rates. It is not a hedge against volatility, it is a hedge against systemic failure. When trust in sovereign currencies wanes, and when the credibility of central banks becomes a variable, not a constant, gold serves not as an investment, but as a counterbalance. It is no longer about upside, it is about preserving purchasing power in a world where confidence is monetized and sold back to the public as fiat. Its value does not rest in growth, but in what it does not do. It does not default, it does not expire, and it cannot be printed. Decentralized digital assets, specifically Bitcoin, offer another form of capital insulation, one that does not rely on centralized validation or geopolitical allegiance. It is not digital gold, nor is it a perfect system. But in a world where monetary authority is increasingly fused with political surveillance, it represents optionality, not for its price, but for its principles. Unlike most assets, it is portable, borderless, and when held properly unseizable. This is not a bet on blockchain evangelism. It is a sober response to the accelerating collapse of financial privacy and the pending implementation of programmable digital currencies. In such a climate, decentralization becomes less about ideology and more about jurisdictional escape velocity. Productive land and real estate, particularly in regions with strong rule of law and strategic demographic trends, offer insulation from currency depreciation and societal breakdown. While housing markets can be speculative and cyclical, land itself, when it produces food, water access, or shelter, transcends valuation models. You do not hedge against inflation with concrete boxes in over-leveraged cities. You hedge with acreage that feeds people or locations that remain relevant regardless of economic sentiment. This is capital in physical form, illiquid, yes, but fundamentally necessary in ways digital assets or equities are not. Exposure to foreign equities, especially in economically diverse and politically stable jurisdictions, diversifies not only capital but assumptions. Home bias is a subtle form of nationalism in portfolio construction. The assumption that one's domestic economy is the safest bet is precisely what history punishes. Strategic international holdings across Asia, parts of Europe, and commodity rich nations provide a counterweight to domestic economic fragility. It is not about chasing high growth markets, but identifying where capital is treated with more respect, regulation is predictable, and monetary policy is less reactive. Private equity or ownership in non-public enterprises represents another layer of insulation, not because it is impervious to economic cycles, but because it exists outside the liquidity-driven distortions of public markets. The best opportunities often emerge before capital becomes popular, while public markets are increasingly driven by narratives and algorithms. Private markets, when accessed intelligently, are driven by fundamentals. This is not a call to speculate on startups. It is a recognition that real businesses solving real problems, insulated from the volatility of market sentiment, will endure when abstraction collapses. Finally, cash proxies, short-term government securities, high-quality money market funds, or tokenized stable instruments backed by reserves serve as a tactical bridge. In moments of dislocation, liquidity is not optional. But the form of liquidity matters. Keeping large sums in traditional bank accounts exposes one to institutional failure, withdrawal limitations, and currency degradation. By holding liquid instruments with low duration risk, one preserves flexibility without embracing the illusion of safety. In deposits that are neither sovereign nor sacrosanct, These 6 vehicles do not offer certainty because certainty itself is a myth sold to the masses in bull markets. What they offer is relative asymmetry. They allow for agility without full exposure, insulation without paralysis. In this new paradigm, wealth must not only be protected from loss, but from entrapment regulatory, monetary, and systemic. The future does not belong to those with the most capital. It belongs to those who understand where capital can still move freely and where it will soon be unable to. The world as we know it does not change gradually. It shifts suddenly when assumptions break down, when consensus shatters, when systems reveal their internal contradictions. In those moments, it is not the strongest who prevail, nor the most informed, but the most adaptive. The future does not reward comfort. It rewards clarity, action, and above all, the willingness to abandon outdated beliefs. Those who wait for certainty are, by definition, late. We are witnessing a fundamental reordering of global structures, economic, political, and psychological. Markets are no longer governed by supply and demand in the traditional sense, but by waves of liquidity, narratives engineered by central banks, and increasingly by geopolitical imperatives. The notion that money is neutral, that governments are rational actors, or that systems will self-correct without intervention, these ideas once offered comfort. Now they offer danger. In this environment, fear disguises itself as prudence. People cling to old models because they once worked. They hoard cash, thinking it offers safety, not realizing it erodes silently each day. They trust systems that no longer trust them. They place their future in the hands of institutions that are themselves navigating chaos. Inaction under these conditions is not neutrality, it is submission. Survival in this era requires a shift in posture, from reactive to anticipatory. One must think not in terms of what is safe, but what is adaptable. Resilience is no longer about strength, it is about optionality. What assets give you flexibility when borders close, currencies fail, or rules change overnight? What forms of value resist censorship, coercion, and confiscation? Adaptability is not instinctive, it must be cultivated. It begins with disillusionment, with the willingness to admit that the game has changed. This is a difficult admission because it threatens the very scaffolding of identity for most people. Their jobs, savings, retirement plans, all premised on the assumption that the future would look like the past. But history is not linear, it is punctuated, and we are in one of those punctuation points now. The danger is not that people will panic. The danger is that they will remain calm when urgency is required. They will interpret disruption as temporary. They will treat signals as noise, and by the time they act, the exit will be crowded. That is how systemic transitions unfold, not with fair warning, but with denial, until denial is no longer possible. To be nimble in this climate is to diversify not only assets, but thinking. It means questioning premises, challenging narratives, and being willing to look where others refuse. Nimbleness is intellectual, it is psychological, it is geographic, financial, and strategic. It means holding assets that are mobile, decisions that are reversible, and plans that are contingent. In such a world, rigidity is fatal. The systems that appear most stable often fall the hardest because they resist adaptation. The same is true for individuals. To bet on stability is to bet against reality. We must recognize that volatility is not a bug, it is the environment. And those who learn to move within it rather than against it will not merely survive. They will shape what comes next. This moment requires neither optimism nor pessimism, but clear-eyed realism. The world is not ending. It is changing, and the delta between those two ideas is vast. Change punishes those who resist it, but rewards those who harness it. There is opportunity here, not in clinging to what was, but in preparing for what will be. There are no safe harbors in this transition, only better questions, smarter positioning, and the humility to adapt. That humility is rare. Most people confuse conviction with truth, but conviction is often just inertia wearing the mask of confidence. The truly prepared are not those who predict perfectly, but those who build resilience into their uncertainty. The future belongs to the nimble, not the fearful, not because fear is irrational, but because fear freezes. And in a world that moves faster than comprehension, the inability to move is the most dangerous position of all. The greatest risks are never on the surface. They lie in what you believe cannot change. The danger of holding cash isn't just in what you might lose, it's in what you no longer see. Security has been replaced by control. Stability has been replaced by management, and wealth must now be protected not just from markets, but from the very systems that claim to protect it. This is not fear-mongering, this is pattern recognition. In the world that is coming, the greatest risk is standing still.